Hi, I'm Andy Hart of SPD Automotive, and I'd like to welcome you all to the first in our series of case webinars. I know it seems strange to kick off a series about the future of the automotive industry when the industry is currently in the middle of a global crisis, but the reality is that while car sales and car production have come to a very sudden halt, planning and engineering teams are still out there having to make difficult decisions about what cars are going to look like in 5 to 10 years' time. So while we're all stuck at home and glued to our makeshift desks, we thought it would be a good time to sit back and reflect on where we're going as an industry. The author Yuval Harari, who wrote the book Sapiens, was on the news a few days ago and was asked about his perspective on the COVID crisis. It was interesting to hear him speak about how the crisis is leading to an acceleration of history that has never been seen before. He gave the example of his university in Israel, which has been talking about setting up a few online courses for years and years, and how after the COVID virus hit, they were able to shift their entire university online within just a few weeks. It's still too early to tell how COVID will affect our industry in the longer term, but one thing that we've learned in the last few months is that change can happen much faster than we ever thought possible. Connected, autonomous, shared and electric cars have been at the epicenter of most OEM strategies for the last few years. Now seems as good a time as ever to assess how those strategies are progressing and where we might see an acceleration or deceleration of those efforts. So today we're going to focus on three questions. What is CASE all about? How far has the industry come? And what's holding us back from achieving some of the goals? To help us explore these questions, I've got Lee Colman and Alain Dunoyer, both of whom head up large teams of experts within SPD. Lee joined us after a long career working on connected cars at Nissan and a telematics service provider, while Alain joined us from Jaguar, where he headed up R&D teams looking into ADAS systems. I'm going to start with you, Lee. Let's get a better understanding of what CASE means. If there's one thing our industry is very good at, it's making up acronyms. But what does it really mean to consumers and to different parts of the industry?
I think the first thing to point out with CASE is that these four areas are the fastest changing in automotive. And part of that pace of change is to meet consumer expectations. Consumer expectations of having their digital lives connected to their cars and not completely separate ecosystems. Assisted driving, taking much more care of driver and passenger and other road users. For shared, this is partly about the environmental effects of using vehicles and producing them in the first place and looking for cleaner cities with less congestion, and electrification obviously to that end as well. As well as this, we're seeing quite a step change in the way that car makers view their own hierarchy of suppliers. More now than ever, car makers are collaborating with each other on these expensive to develop technologies and looking to differentiate on user experiences rather than core technologies. And that's making quite a difference in the way that OEMs view their partners and suppliers. So we're seeing a much more expansive network of companies and partnerships that goes way beyond the traditional OEM hierarchy.
Your team's been quite focused on helping car makers deploy and monetize connected car services. Can you talk us through specifically what the drivers are for offering connectivity in cars?
Yes, I think this has changed over time. Initially, services were novel. Connectivity offered several novel features that could attract new customers, particularly around safety, security, remote control of vehicles, remote access to vehicles. That in turn led to more standardization of those features as they came down the tiers of trim grades and into lower segment vehicles. OEMs sought to expand revenue streams by charging for those services either directly through options or even subscriptions. As the services generated more and more data, the industry's seen opportunities to decrease costs. Over-the-air updates are a great example of that, where just maintenance of software, even recalls, can be handled in a much cheaper way that's better for the consumer as well. And the mission of most car companies is to engender greater loyalty as well, whether that's through people getting their cars serviced, maintained, repaired in the franchise dealerships, through the better connection that the car companies have and the dealers have through connectivity, or whether it's through the services being so useful to the consumer that when they're reconsidering another car, coming off lease or making another purchase, if the services have been useful enough to them, the hope is that those consumers will stay loyal to the brand.
So given that, where do you think the bulk of the industry is today? It's been 20 years since the first connected cars came onto the market. Where are most OEMs in their kind of maturity scale?
So that changes as you look at OEM groups and confidence about offering attractive services that will expand revenue streams and provide that loyalty. Those who've been providing those services for longest have the most confidence in making that relationship between loyalty, revenue, cost reduction, and attracting new customers build up into a very attractive model. In markets where there's less maturity than that, I would point to China and India. The novelty of connected services is still about ticking lots of feature boxes. It's about having something that differentiates you from a competitor, having some wow features in the vehicle that can be advertised, talked about, experienced by car buyers. As the model matures, though, the cost of putting that novelty into the car can be slightly offset by monetizing the data, either by monetizing directly, selling data to other parties with the customer consent, generally for adjacent industries like leasing or insurance, or more confidently managing cost within the business and keeping retention. But really importantly, the whole industry, regardless of where the OEM is on that maturity curve, in which region, is aiming towards the services being as useful to the consumer as possible. I think that's the biggest lesson that's been learned over the last decade or so. The services will have novelty for a while, but if they're not useful to the customer in a genuine way that's authentic to the brand ID the OEM is trying to reinforce, then the whole balance of that connected offering doesn't stack up. So we're heading more towards services being super useful and convenient to use.
It's interesting because in some ways, I guess the kind of hype cycle around data monetization is getting to a sudden realization about the fact that it needs to be paired up with a good user experience. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that companies and individuals were talking about huge amounts of money being made by selling data from cars. At one point, I even heard a statistic of being able to subsidize the entire cost of the car by selling data to third parties. What's happened to some of that discussion?
Well, at SBD, we've never joined in the hype behind those numbers. We look at the needs of the value chain. So where are the use cases that need to be fed by data that can be collected from vehicles? Why are those use cases deficient in data today, whether it's inside automotive or outside? And how can that data add more use or value to the use case that they're feeding? So we tend to approach the situation from a problem statement. Where does the problem exist, and how can vehicle data and connectivity help? And a lot of the value originates within the OEM. So it's cost reductions, it's understanding the consumer life cycle better, what's being used in the car, what isn't, what's valued. And we're starting to see really interesting evolution of that now, where services can be offered on demand, features on demand. You know, the OEMs that have studied this the longest and have the most data about which services are being used understand the value at a point in time and a point of need for that particular service or feature now. So the value is certainly there. It's not enough to pay for the whole car, sadly, as some of those early projections said, but inevitably it plays a very large part in the OEM's understanding of their customer base and how to make a product that's much nicer to use and will, if the mix is right, encourage spend on services that are really useful to the customer.
So it's less of a direct money maker in that sense, but more of a building block towards delivering better customer experiences across the entire ownership journey, I guess.
Yeah, if you look at journeys in other verticals, insights that can be gained from data about how services are being used, who's using them, and where and when and how. This is how services become much more personalized to us, whether we're streaming content, buying stuff online. Those great services that we rely on tend to know more about us and use that data to make a better experience for us. If my navigation system knows more about me, I have to spend less time interfacing with it than actually using it. I can have less stressful journeys if I can have services like predictive parking that allow me to pay without getting out of the car. It's simple. It's a simple little stack of a lot of tiny features that add up to a much more convenient life. And if any consumer can save time, money, effort, stress, then the product has to be more appealing. And I think that's where the smart OEMs are really making good partnerships inside and outside automotive to make those experiences better. And it's the way of so many sectors. I would say automotive's been a little behind the curve, catching on to that, but catching up fast.
So next week's webinar, we're going to start looking in more detail around connectivity. So we'll kick off with Lee and some of his team. In the meantime, I wanted to move on to you, Alain. Talk us a little bit through what the key drivers are for automating cars.
Okay, so vehicle autonomy is quite a broad topic, as it covers people transportation, but also goods transportation and delivery. So we tend at SBD to look at autonomy into 3 different layers. So the first one being a personal vehicle. So for personal vehicles, the driver is mainly safety, but also now moving towards providing new productivity opportunities to the people in the car. The second layer is shared vehicle or mobility as a service. And really here, the focus is about reducing the operating cost by, for example, removing the need for a driver, as well as providing improved service coverage and frequency. And the last one, the third category, is the optimization of goods delivery. Again, by reducing some of the costs associated with it, but also optimizing the management of door-to-door delivery. Just as an example, in terms of home shopping and such things, we see more and more, certainly in Europe, an expectation to have delivery within the hour of clicking. So that really dictates from a completely new approach to meet that demand.
Sometimes it feels like the industry's got a slight split personality disorder when it comes to autonomous cars. Sometimes even within the same company, they send out very different messages about what's a realistic expectation from a consumer's point of view in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years' time. What's your view about why this is happening and realistically how fast we're moving along that journey?
So maybe again, keeping the same 3 different layers, if we talk at first passenger vehicles automation, it's been a reality for more than 20 years. I mean, if you think about of ABS or traction control system, which are now completely standardized and very common, those are the very early examples of an automated system. But since then, things have moved on quite a lot. And we are now entering new level of vehicle autonomy and standardization. And the focus, certainly in the last 10 to 15 years, has been safety and avoiding a collision being the ultimate goal of the industry. And organizations such like Euro NCAP have been very, very influential in making sure that OEMs are fitting more and more technologies such as collision avoidance. What we see also in the more expensive segments, we starting to move towards the next level, the higher level of autonomy, where the driver is still in charge at all time. That's a very, very important condition. But the braking, the acceleration, and the cornering of the car is largely automated. So we are very much at the beginning of a new phase where maybe in a couple of years, you might be able to stop monitoring and being in charge of a car at all time. So that's something that is likely to happen either later this year or early next year within some premium OEMs, where we get to the much higher level of autonomy. So that's for passenger vehicle, which is one category. When we talk about shared vehicle and shared automation, here the automation can help reducing operating costs. for example, knowing you're the driver, but you would need teleoperation. So you need like a control room that can remotely monitor and potentially control the different pods. But it's also about improving service coverage and frequency. And that we can see two main use cases to cover this. The first one is the last mile to join maybe one transportation hub from another. So maybe as an example, you might be arriving at a train station and you want to go to the city center, and you just jump onto a pod that takes you there. So really those use cases are where maybe the public transportation system is not as good as maybe it should be. Similarly, you have round loop to service community or gated community. The other aspect, or the other typical use case, is to operate a fleet of fully autonomous vehicle. And that's really about providing some new mobility services within the city, typically. And typically it would be a service on demand, where you're being picked up where you currently are and you're being dropped off at your desired destination. And finally, for goods transportation, the two main use cases are the last mile delivery from a local shop, for example. So we've already seen lots of proof of concept or even trials where within a mile you've got like a warehouse that can deliver goods within a mile radius of the warehouse. The last one is truck platooning, and that's probably the one we're going to see first at some scale. It's probably the more mature one. Truck platooning for long distance, but that is really just for heavy goods transportation.
Lee, if we move now on to shared mobility, it's kind of a spectrum of services and business models that spans from all the way from e-scooters to the autonomous shuttles that Alain was just talking about. Can you talk us through what's driving this explosion of localized shared mobility services and how you see it eventually merging with some of those trends towards autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, there are a number of drivers behind this trend. The first being the cost of vehicle ownership, an inconvenience, particularly in cities, about parking those vehicles and the expense of keeping the car. And then the environmental impacts of having lots of vehicles in the city, the congestion impact, are all creating a need for us to reconsider the way that we move, particularly in urban environments. I think the most schemes started by providing access to non-car owners with alternative modes of transport to public transport. Useful if you need to be doing a large shopping trip, or if you're visiting a city away from home, or if you just want to use a vehicle for an hour or two. No point in paying for a traditional rental for a whole day. The attraction of making movement around cities has been encouraged by some city planners, and it's enabled those operating the services to reduce their bricks and mortar and staffing investments to more of a self-service model. The difficulty that the shared mobility schemes face is a high level of fragmentation, whether it's about the modes of transport that are on offer or the physical locations of the vehicles, a lack of ubiquity from city to city, let alone country to country. At the moment, it's difficult for someone wanting to use these services to make multimodal journeys. Some providers are addressing that need. So Google Maps now allows you to select or at least plan journeys in multimodal form. And several city planners are trying to group together ecosystems of service operators to make multimodal possible. But it's still incredibly fragmented. And while that fragmentation exists, there's a lack of data that can inform those services to be more intelligent.
Since the outbreak of COVID, we've seen some of these services shutting down. Most of these services have to shut down to some level. Some of these startups have laid off some of their staff members. There seems to be a kind of a tightening of that opportunity. What do you guys think is going to be the longer term effect on shared mobility of the COVID virus?
Well, I think the initial phases of lockdown, people didn't want to share their space, let alone another vehicle with someone. So it was a very predictable reaction, I guess. If you're asking people to isolate or keep 2 meters distance away from one another, there's going to be less appetite to share vehicles or even scooters. However, groups of the population have had to continue paying for their own vehicles, whether it's lease or paying off loans, insurance costs, and so on. The asset that sits on our driveway or in our garage starts to take on a slightly different look. So I think post-virus, people will be readdressing their spending habits. We're already seeing car companies and lease companies launch more flexible leases. And I think shorter, more flexible access to vehicles is going to accelerate on the back of this pandemic.
And do you think there'll be any changes to how some of these startups and some of the bigger companies manage their shared mobility services?
Yeah, I think we'll see some impact, and we're starting to see it. So maybe in the short term, we can expect more startup to disappear more quickly or be acquired as finding investment may become more difficult. But also, I think the attitude towards shared mobility and kind of joining what Lisa mentioned, we will probably shift more towards a private space rather than a shared environment. So I think we can expect a shift towards more personal pods is likely in the future in terms of consumer preferences. This also means that operators of such automated fleets will need to demonstrate even more than before that they can keep the pod's interior clean at all times, or at least between journeys. So far, one of the emphasis was to make sure that, for example, spillage can be detected and then the pod's interior can be cleaned before the next customer comes. We may have to even think now about deep clean procedures so that things like COVID-19 can be guaranteed not to be present in the pod. So there are technologies for that, but this is very, very much the beginning of it.
I guess one of the things that's been interesting over the last couple of months is seeing how information becomes more important, and to reassure people about the direction that some of these issues is moving towards. I wonder if there's going to be a greater importance placed on sharing information about those shared vehicles and when they were last maintained and last cleaned to help give confidence to consumers. Because unlike a dirty car or a car that has been damaged by the previous users, something like a virus is very difficult to tell whether a vehicle has been cleaned or not. So could it give an opportunity to companies to find new ways of reassuring people, users?
Yes, I think if companies can demonstrate they have procedures in place and also being independently audited and having like a seal of approval by an independent organization would certainly go a long way in making sure that the public is kind of reassured that the right thing are being done. But that's very much uncharted territory. So there's probably a new industry there that needs to be created.
Yeah, it's interesting. For years now, I've been going to CES, and every year there's a portion of the startup hall and a few other kind of areas within CES that focus on wellness of ambient technologies and being able to kind of clean the air around you. And it always felt relatively niche because it didn't feel like that many people were that fussed about whether their air was purified. But I can imagine a lot of that technology now will become even more important.
Yeah, I'm entirely. I mean, the cabin interior quality, the air quality, the light quality is something that traditional OEMs have been doing some action in that space. Many of the premium OEMs now you can get flagrants and other things in cars. But I think you're right. I mean, with COVID-19 and what's currently happening, there'll be a lot more focus in terms of how can you make sure that the interior of a car or a pod is clean.
Yeah, absolutely. So that brings us round to the E in case. Lee, in many ways, electrification has been kind of the most widely understood shift in the industry, isn't it?
Yes, I think in many respects it's been widely understood. Everyone understands that the clean energy impact of electric vehicles, particularly in cities again, can have great benefits. I think what's taken consumers a little bit more time to get up to speed with is the realities of charging, overcoming range anxiety, and really understanding how to get the best out of an EV.
And do you think, I mean, we've seen some incredible scenes over the last week around the oil market going negative because of the kind of surplus of supply. Do you think that's going to affect at all the longer term viability of electric vehicles? Will it change the pace at which the industry moves?
There's no doubt that the industry is spending large amounts of R&D and production dollars on migrating from ICE vehicles to EV. There's a clear pull from consumers. Depending on how you calculate it, we're still not at price parity between EV and ICE. I think there needs to be higher acceptance of EV by local councils and governments around the world to help people arrange more charging points at their place of work, their place of home. But inevitably, the industry has to move towards a stronger EV fleet.
Carbon emission and pollution reduction targets are a key driver and can be achieved in a number of ways. So the solution in the short to medium term is not necessarily going to be going fully electric, but clearly this is happening. I think with COVID-19, it's also possible that people will work a lot more from home in the future. So we may experience a mechanical reduction of carbon emissions due to the new working habits. So people may still travel, but may favor shorter distances. And if that really happens, then the need and the type of vehicles they will need in the future might be a little bit different from what was so far expected.
Yeah, it's interesting because, as you say, Alain, there's so many different dynamics at play now between consumers changing their habits. Also, governments will have to change their policies to some extent, I'm guessing. If there's been so much cutbacks on businesses, they may start to deregulate certain areas and at the very least delay some of the targets that they'd set. So with all of this kind of up in the air, it's going to be very interesting to see whether the kind of positive drivers for electrification outweigh the negative drivers. Alain, there's also some other kind of technical drivers, I guess, for new platforms within the industry linked to autonomous vehicles. Do you want to share a little bit around how new platforms are also being used as a way to introduce new electrical architectures within the car that can support some of these new features?
So yeah, so we see a number of converging sort of trends. So there's electrification, but there's also more and more ADAS and autonomy in the car, which means that the electrical architecture needs to move significantly from where we are now. And from a very, I would say, a patchwork network of ECU, we are moving slowly but surely towards aggregation of ECUs and very large domain ECUs. And that goes well with the electrification of vehicles as well, because you effectively have less components. So you can simplify your electrical architecture even further. So it is quite possible that the two platforms from an ICE and an EV will potentially converge in terms of electrical layout and electrical architecture. What we saw is that for EVs to maybe to have more of a business case in terms of autonomy specifically, having a platform that is single usage is quite limiting. So what you have to do really is have a very generic platform that can serve multi-purpose use cases. So it could be a platform that does people transportation, but can also do cargo transport. And if you have that kind of flexibility, that makes your business case for those platforms a lot stronger. And the utilization of those platforms can be well, close to 24/7 potentially.
So that's CASE in a nutshell. It's the biggest change to both the customer experience and the way our industry operates, really since Henry Ford revolutionized mass manufacturing. So during the next 5 episodes, we're going to go deeper into defining these different phases that the industry is going through in order to deliver the CASE transformation. But I'd like to get from both of you, before we end today, a quick takeaway on where you think the focus is going to be for the industry moving forward, and what are some of the challenges that we need to overcome as an industry to enable CASE. Alain, do you want to kick us off with your view of what some of those barriers are?
So for autonomy, I can see 2 major hurdles, say. So the first one is certainly legislation on homologation requirements and how long this is going to take before they are fully formalized. For SE level 3, just to remind what it is, it's basically a fully autonomous vehicle where the driver doesn't need to supervise the machine all the time, but the driver is there as a backup. So if the machine needs to hand over control, the driver needs to be able to do that. So SE level 3, we are very, very close, just around the corner. The homologation is expected to become available later this year. But how do we move from a level 3 to a level 4 in terms of homologation and legislation is something that is still somewhat unclear. The other aspect is, and that's a really difficult one for all manufacturers, is the ability to demonstrate that as you move towards higher level of autonomy, where the driver supervision eventually will disappear altogether, how do you guarantee that that system is safe enough? How do you define safe enough? This is very much an unanswered question in the industry, and there are many, many different opinions and views on what safe enough could be or should be. And having established that, how do you demonstrate this? So there's a lot of work there to be done.
What about you, Lee? What's your kind of summary on CASE, and where do you think are some of the key pitfalls that the industry is going to have to navigate around?
So I'm going to focus my comments mainly on the C and the S. For connected services, I think that there needs to be a genuine addressing of the consumer need for more convenience. This is being answered by other verticals working together, and I think we're going to see a lot more collaboration between car makers and what could be perceived as threats from consumer electronic, those that know most about our digital lives. If you get true convenience and true creativity in use cases, there needs to be a working together. It can't be single brand thinking. So the challenge there is going to be making sure the ecosystems can work together, and there can be a level of differentiation that the brands can offer. On the shared mobility, again, this depends heavily on collaboration between operators in the shared mobility space. Matching up demand with need is the biggest challenge that part of the industry faces. And really, we need a super broker or a facility for those with demand, customers wanting to make journeys, to share that information in a way that can be understood by service providers in real time, as well as looking historically. So I think in both cases, it's about the operators of the services having consumer consent to access of data with the consumer's convenience at the heart of any model that's put forward.
That's great. I want to thank both you and Alain really for sharing your insights today. And I want to invite everyone who's listening in to join us next week. Our topic's going to be connectivity, and we're going to be going deeper into some of these areas that Lee's been talking about. Why has it been harder for car makers to monetize data? And is it going to get any easier? Why are there so many disconnected cars out there? And what does the industry need to do to shift from making cars to successfully operating services? And what does it mean practically to offer personalized services? And why is it potentially so important for the future of the industry? We're going to be joined again by Lee next week, and he's going to bring along Jack Palmer, who's got a lot of hands-on experience in areas like data monetization. So we hope you've enjoyed the first webinar in our case study series, and look forward to seeing you again next week.